and you just caught a whiff of that scent, I just want you to take a pause for a minute and just imagine how that would make you feel. In reality, someone that has gone through a certain level of trauma that's probably even devolved into post-traumatic stress disorder will feel instantly, will feel fear, will feel anxiety, will feel depression, will feel hopelessness. They may even be triggered in their body to start to look for a way to feel safe. Today's video, we are going to discuss the impact of trauma on the soul. Yes, we are talking about trauma's impact on the soul. I want to walk us through what trauma means, that there's a definition of trauma that's different from post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're going to compare notes on what trauma is and how that devolves into post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm going to give a little bit of a brief explanation of what I mean by the soul, because we know that the soul comprises of three components. The very famous psychologist Sigmund Freud and Carl Rogers, humanistic psychology, made note of that, and we see from a biblical perspective that actually it gives us the fundamental definition of what comprises of our soul. I'm going to go on also to discuss some very key and important statistics, mostly centered around the UK, and then I'm going to give you some examples of what causes trauma, what causes post-traumatic stress disorders. Then we're going to highlight some symptoms in both cases, and finally give you some ideas and some practical ways to overcome these issues. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Susan. I am your counsellor and coach, and if you're finding this video and you're finding this channel exciting and interesting so far, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with as many people as you think would benefit from it. Let's jump right into it. So trauma is really an emotional response to deeply distressing situations and events. I've got my notes down here, so I'm just going to go back and forth between my notes and speaking to you, but I just want to make sure that I'm giving you all the right information that have been researched. I literally spent so many months doing this research and reading. I've read books by Bessel van der Kolk, I've read books by other psychologists, I've read books and comparing these notes also to the Bible, which is foundational for my belief. So if you're new to this channel, a lot of the things that we'll be discussing center around human psychology, behavioral psychology, and how toxic relationship and toxic dynamics in relationship actually impact our lives. And I center a lot of these readings and research back to the core knowledge of the Word of God. So like I was saying earlier, trauma can be caused by a distressing or disturbing event that causes physical, emotional, or psychological harm. And a really good example of this could be someone being involved in a car accident, experiencing a natural disaster like a flash flood, or perhaps even finding themselves in an abusive situation. On the other hand, post-traumatic disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, some people call it PTSD, is a mental health condition that is triggered by experiencing or witnessing trauma. As I mentioned earlier, trauma is caused by distressing events that is out of the individual's control. So when that event goes on and is more persistent, has characteristics of lasting longer than initial trauma, it devolves into post-traumatic stress disorder that has an impact on mental health and also has an impact on their psychological capacity or limits to processing that initial trauma. And the post-traumatic stress disorder has an impact and has the capacity to actually affect someone's ability to function on a day-to-day basis. So what I mean by this, an example would be when someone is driving, someone has been in an accident and they're driving back and they go past that spot of where the accident happened and they get a flashback. So that's a conscious flashback. An unconscious flashback would be if they were, for example, just in the house and, you know, they just randomly remembered that event. That wasn't triggered by anything around them, but it just came to their mind that they'd been through such a traumatic event, that would form an unconscious flashback. And most times people have avoidance behaviors after going through a traumatic event for months on end. Duration wise, so traumatic experiences that people go through typically are short term, and the symptoms often improve with time and with the right support. Post-traumatic stress disorder, on the other hand, has a tendency to last for more than a month, and it can cause significant impairment in the person's ability to assess the realities of things that have gone on. So they might struggle to disengage from that traumatic impact or that traumatic effect even after it's long gone. Some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that's a bit longer term include intrusive memories, so memories that come in without their sitting down to concoct those memories. Flashbacks, as mentioned earlier, they might have nightmares. Hypervigilance, they're always on the edge, always thinking worst case scenario, even when the environment is not calling for the worst case scenario. They would avoid triggers, so things that would remind them of that trauma that they had gone through. So for example, if someone was in a very toxic relationship, they might avoid going to places that they used to eat with that person in the past, like restaurants. They might avoid going to certain shops. They might avoid buying certain items that reminds them of this individual, or they might avoid even being in the presence, in the midst of other people that have relationships with this other person, or perhaps even start to withdraw from social gatherings and isolate themselves because they're now starting to feel anxious and depressed. They might avoid buying certain fragrances because that would remind them of how that person may have smelled like, or they might even avoid living in certain locations and houses because that place carries memories of the level of toxicity that they had to endure in that relationship. And it causes also emotional numbness, where when someone has gone through an ongoing persistent traumatic experience like toxic relationships or abuse, they might start to numb themselves emotionally from feeling the pain. So this can impair their judgment of healthy relationships, in the sense that if they feel somehow excited about a prospect of a new relationship, they might want to numb that pain down because they can't trust. Like going back to the idea of impairment, they are not certain that this real relationship or this potential relationship has got something good to offer them. And so they would always have this mindset of always thinking the worst, always being hyper vigilant, even in scenarios and cases that don't call for hypervigilance. So emotionally, they numb themselves from feeling love, joy, peace, safety, because they felt that when they had given themselves to this other person in the past relationship, that innocence was taken for granted. On the other hand, when we talk about the symptoms of traumatic events on an individual that's experienced trauma, we dial it down a little bit more from post-traumatic stress disorder, because symptoms or emotional responses of trauma can include feeling afraid in the moment. So for example, trauma being, a distressing or disturbing event that causes emotional or psychological harm, as in someone going through or having experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, being in a situation where there's a natural disaster like a flash flood. They may be in that moment afraid, they may feel a sense of hopelessness, they may feel a sense of sadness, they may even at some point feel depressed, they may feel angry. But the difference between traumatic symptoms and emotional responses and post-traumatic symptoms and emotional responses is that with trauma, these symptoms and responses reduce over time. However, with post-traumatic stress disorder, it is a heightened response to a traumatic event that does not reduce over time, but rather can persist for over a month, and if not treated or if not diagnosed on time, can actually have a negative impact on that person's life and can impair their ability to do things on a day-to-day basis. So the NHS would also define it as a one-off event, trauma being a one-off event like accidents or assaults or ongoing stress such as abuse or neglect. The psychologist Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and I've literally read through that book, and his definition of trauma can be likened to not just something that happens to us physically, but rather it is how our body processes and experiences certain emotions, and how our body stores up these emotions and how it impacts the body's nervous systems. From a biblical perspective, Proverbs 18 verse 14 says, "The spirit of a man sustains him in sickness, but who can bear a broken spirit?" According to the statistics by NHS Digital Mental Health of Children and Young People in England, approximately 1 in 3 UK adults have experienced trauma during their childhood. A similar statistic states in the US that 1 in 3 adults actually experienced trauma in the sense of neglect, abuse, abandonment in their childhood. So trauma, I feel like over the years hasn't gotten better, but rather it seems like there's a trend where it's getting worse. And according to UK Trauma Council, it highlights that over 40% of adults, they report adverse childhood experiences, which many of them carry into adulthood, both in a sense not even realizing that those experiences in childhood, from going through abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, from going through neglect, from going through abandonment, would have an adverse impact on them in their adulthood. So a lot of the times when people go through trauma in their childhood, it's sort of filed away in their brain somewhere, and it only takes that person to go into adulthood and for a similar situation to happen again before that memory comes back and resurfaces. And you find that a lot of adults actually are processing trauma. For the ones that even are able to recognize that they had gone through certain dysfunction in their childhood, they're at an advantage in the sense that they are aware of what the trauma impact had on them. So they're even in a better position to be able to admit that they went through trauma and get the necessary help. But there's a certain level and a certain percentage of adults today that don't even have an idea that what they had gone through in their childhood is having an impact on their life today. So an example of someone that's gone through something in their childhood that you don't realize it's had an adverse effect on them today would be someone that most times focuses and gets lost in overworking. So it might have been that someone like that, grew up in abject poverty or had experienced a sense of lack and poverty growing up, so that when they became an adult, they had made up their mind subconsciously to not find themselves in that position again, so that anything that would cause them to have a sense of not having enough or have a sense of lack pushes them to work, so that they develop this habit of working most times above and beyond expectations, and they overwork, not realizing that they need time to rest. Trauma, so these are the detailed causes of trauma, can be caused by different events, but will not always be serious. So for example, finding themselves in a situation that's dire. So where there's a natural disaster that's unexpected, like an earthquake or flash flood, or even losing a job, being made redundant. When these events, if they're able to, dissipate over time, then there's potential that there's not going to be adverse effect on their psychological well-being, their mental well-being, their emotional well-being, and their behavioral aspects. However, when trauma issues extend beyond a time period of generally about a month, then it starts to devolve into something else. So traumatic events that if is consistent over time, can have an impact on mental health and psychological well-being and devolve into post-traumatic stress disorder include being a victim of personal or sexual assault, being a victim of abuse, violence, or severe neglect, being involved in road accidents, being held hostage, or witnessing a terrorist attack. Some practical indicators of unresolved trauma that has gone on to be developed into post-traumatic stress disorder, as mentioned earlier, includes flashbacks of past events. So these flashbacks can be triggered by sounds, smells, environments, people reminding you of some events or scenarios that happened that wasn't really resolved. Another indicator of unresolved trauma includes intrusive thoughts and memories. It also includes, as mentioned, emotional numbness, where you are feeling disconnected from day-to-day activities, you're feeling disconnected from your relationships, you're not giving new relationships a chance, and you're struggling to maintain existing or older relationships. There are also behaviors like where you're starting to avoid things, you're avoiding people, you're avoiding situations that remind you of the trauma, you're avoiding objects as well that possibly remind you of the trauma. So objects in terms of clothing, apparel, you're avoiding using certain products because it reminds you of the adverse experience that you had had. Most people don't realize this, but when they start to avoid going to certain places or doing certain things, it's because there's something connected to that particular object or place that makes them uncomfortable. It triggers them, and people always say this, like they use this term, I feel triggered by something. It's because that something or that somewhere or that someone reminds you of a very unpleasant experience that you'd had, and the only way that your brain can deal with it is to avoid finding yourself in that situation. It's kind of like a survival mechanism that kicks in when you feel that you are in a threat situation. Now, the way the brain works is if we are triggered by certain things, our body releases certain hormones that communicate to the brain to protect us. So adrenaline and cortisol are stress hormones that are released into our body and our system. But when this is over time constantly being pumped into us, the brain is not given a chance to disconnect from that stressful memory or event or situation. And because the brain is in constant fight or flight mode, it can actually impact and affect the way people would behave. So you find that some people start to have or exhibit erratic behaviors, which we're going to come on to in the next part of this topic, but since we're on it, I just wanted to make a note of that. People start to have erratic behaviors because the brain is not able to connect the logical aspect of thinking and feeling safe, which is the reality in most cases after the traumatic event has passed. But a lot of people get stuck in this emotional brain cycle where they are not responding to the logical aspect. So the emotional cycle is constantly being pumped because the level of stress hormones that have been released. But the moment someone is able to connect back to the logical aspect of their brain that tells them actually you're not in a stressful situation, this event, yes, though it happened in the past, is not what's happening right now. If a person is able to connect the dots and know that actually what has happened in the past is not affecting me right now. Though I might be in that situation, though I might be picking up this object, though I might be speaking to someone that knows that person, if that person's brain is able to connect the dots, then they're able to disengage from the stressful hormones and the fight or flight hormones, or the fight or flight responses that their body tells them to run away from. In situations where there is danger, so in situations where someone is going through an actual traumatic event, where there has been a car crash, for example, or there's been a natural disaster, for example, or where someone finds themselves in an abusive or a limiting situation where they have to protect themselves, then it is in their right to respond to protect themselves from that threat. However, when someone is stuck in a cycle of ongoing abuse, ongoing exposure to trauma, it makes their brain not function the way that it was designed to. So that initially, though yes, we are meant to listen to what our body tells us in terms of responding to threats and finding safety, when someone is in a constant place of threat, in a constant place of experiencing abuse, there's a potential and likelihood that the brain starts to constantly pump out those hormones and starts to take on those responses as the norm. So there's no chance where that person actually disconnects from the ongoing presence of threat over time. So what I just spoken about, a practical indicator, was avoiding behavior, so that the person is stuck in this loop where they're not able to avoid the ability or their new formed character of avoiding certain places and things. I hope that makes sense. Do like this video if you've been tracking with me so far, and do put your comments down below. I really want to hear your opinion on this. And the last physical practical indicator of ongoing trauma that's been unresolved, that then devolves into PTSD. Remember, trauma and PTSD are different. Trauma, short term; PTSD, long term. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an offshoot of an ongoing traumatic event like abuse, neglect, or experiencing a road accident or physical assault. So the physical symptoms really are a telltale sign of all the things that an individual would have been experiencing within themselves anyway. So it can include things like stomach aches, it could include things like headaches, it could include things like nausea, even insomnia and sleep disturbances if there's no clear medical cause. So there's some practical ways to overcome, but before I go into that, I put down a really good example scenario. So for example, a woman that's a 35-year-old mother notices that she feels panicked whenever her husband raises his voice. Even if he's not angry with her, she feels her heart racing, her mind goes blank, and she feels like a child again. She will avoid conversations when conflict arises because of the fear of abandonment. Ways to overcome trauma ways to identify trauma, and ways to really, because the best thing to do is actually recognize that, recognize that you went through a traumatic event. Once you're able to recognize you went through a traumatic event, you're then able to pinpoint the details of the trauma and how it affected you. And that way you're able to identify that you need a certain type of help. It could be counseling, it could be talking therapy, it could be going to a psychologist, it could be going to a psychotherapist. It depends on the level of work that needs to be done. A counselor would normally sit you down and speak with you on one-to-one basis and try to help you to deal with the here and now. A lot of the times counseling can also be wrapped up in cognitive behavioral therapy, it can be wrapped up in talking therapy, where we focus on the here and now. How did that traumatic event affect you, and how has it impacted you in just recent time. A psychologist or psychotherapist actually would do a bit more deeper work than a counsellor would normally do, where they don't focus just on the present, but they also drill down into past and previous experiences and how those past and previous experiences are playing a role in how you are behaving today, how it's impacting you emotionally, physically, mentally, psychologically, in every sphere. So that they then take, for example, experiences that you had in your childhood, perhaps from neglect, abuse, abandonment, and they would help you to identify how that's shaped you as a person today in your adult life, and then give you some tools, and you together would discuss some possible practical ways to address those issues so that it's not impacting your life going forward. And then on the other hand, a psychologist would use more scientific methods and research methods to diagnose specifically what's happened and how, with medical intervention sometimes, you can heal from those past traumatic experiences. So ways to overcome trauma with the hopes that it doesn't devolve into PTSD, and potentially even if you find that you're in a space or situation where you're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, some practical ways would be knowing that you're in that space, being aware that, you know, that these reactions that you're feeling are linked to past trauma and not just the current or present situation. Number 2, grounding exercises. So you're able to, in a space and in a sense where you've identified that you're aware, you know that there are certain things that trigger those responses from you. As mentioned before, someone coming out of a toxic, abusive relationship can be triggered by a certain perfume, can be triggered by certain scents, because possibly that perfume reminds you of the scent of the person that used to maltreat you. So that comes into awareness. If you went into a perfume shop, for example, and you just caught a whiff of that scent, I just want you to take a pause for a minute and just imagine how that would make you feel. In reality, someone that has gone through a certain level of trauma that's probably even devolved into post-traumatic stress disorder will feel instantly, will feel fear, will feel anxiety, will feel depression, will feel hopelessness. They may even be triggered in their body to start to look for a way to feel safe, so that it will release stress hormones into their bloodstreams that will constantly pump to their brain, find safety, where they might then start to look for an avenue to escape that environment. But one has to remember, and as I've spoken earlier, that the trauma that had happened in the past, though it may be associated with the person, an object, a smell, a thing, a tangible, intangible object coming through flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, one way to overcome that situation there and then, a very practical way, is to literally just practice your grounding exercise. So one thing that I've employed in my own life is to literally take a moment to just stop and breathe and remember 5 things, or we could do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, where you're able to touch 5 things around you. You're able to listen out for 4 different sounds. You're able to look for 3 objects around you. You're able to try and identify 2 different smells, and you're able to try and taste 1 thing in your mouth. It could be your lunch, it could be your breakfast. The idea of using the grounding exercise and the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique is so that you're connecting your brain back. Remember, I spoke about the emotional and the logical part of the brain. You're connecting your brain back to the present here and now, reminding yourself that you're no longer in danger. Though an object, though a smell reminds you of the past experience you had, you are in actual fact no longer in danger, because the event that happened last week, a month, 2 months, a year ago, a couple of years back. Though yes, it happened in the past, it is not a reflection of the present. So the technique of the 5-4-3-2-1 model will help you in practically just coming out of that space of anxiety, fear, that space of that trauma cage or stronghold, and it shifts your perspective back into the here and now and the reality of today. And if you take that and you actually practice it, you realize that if and when you get into a state like that, it becomes automatic because you've been practicing it for a while. And you also feel a sense of relief in your mind and a sense of difference once that happens. A third way to overcome trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder is actually to seek support. So you speak to a trusted counsellor, you speak to a professional counsellor, you speak to a professional Christian counsellor, you speak to someone that's got the experience, not just on paper or by studying, but they actually have the real life experience and can relate to what you're feeling. They can feel the sense of empathy for what you're feeling. Because it's very key that whoever you speak to is not just someone that's trusted or someone that's been certified or someone that's got the experience professionally, but in a sense as well, especially when it comes to the area of trauma, abuse, mental health, intimate partner relationship violence, toxic relationships, it is very key that you feel safe, because it is such a sensitive area and a topic. And the fact that you're even able to, and you're willing to speak to someone, it shows the level of grit and courage that you have. And I hammer on the importance of actually speaking to someone that's a Christian counselor like myself, because of the importance of speaking to someone that just will not give you tools and techniques that are secular and worldly, but that's also grounded in a spiritual space. And the reason I say this is, of all the professions that I've come across in my time, counseling, therapy, psychology, psychotherapy is very close, a lot more closer to the space and the sphere of the spirit realm than any other profession. Like, actually, because psychology has the tendency to wade in to the spirit realm in the area of an aspect of the soul, in the area of the emotions, in the area of how the mind works, in the area of how the brain works, in the area of in the area of behavior, in the area of the spirit realm, and then also has the same ability to wade into the physical. So when we talk about psychology and psychologists, we talk about mental health, we talk about anxiety, depression, stress, obsessive compulsive disorder, we talk about attention deficit hyperactive disorder, we talk about dementia, we talk about schizophrenia, we talk about postnatal depression. All these areas and all these branches of mental health are can be treated physically. So when we talk about treatments, a lot of the times treatments and medications are not prescribed to patients unless it is absolutely necessary. Sometimes unless these symptoms cannot go away by just speaking to people, like counseling and talking therapy, and where there's a need to actually prescribe medication to be able to manage those symptoms and those effects on the patients. That's the physical aspect. We also look at the impact of certain behaviors on people's minds, on people's behaviors, on people's emotions. And these three aspects, which is what I really want to touch on in this series, is really how we are noticing and how we've noticed psychology, psychotherapy, counseling can wade in between physical aspect of medication and the spiritual and soul aspect of impact on mind, impact on the will, someone's ability to make choices, an impact on the emotions, someone's emotions, the heart, and it impacts on how people generally feel. So I always touch on that aspect of going to a Christian counselor, because at least you know that the counsel that they are giving you is not going to be based on an Eastern ancient practice of meditation and yoga. It doesn't go into the area of hypnotism, but rather it stays in there's the true aspect of psychology and the science behind it, but it's also grounded on the truth of the Word of God. Because even though we credit Sigmund Freud for being the modern day humanistic psychology, the aspect of his understanding of psychology was actually birthed from the foundational principles of the Word of God that says that the soul is comprised of the mind, the will, and the emotions. I always like to think of it this way: if your car gets broken, or if you needed to go for an MOT test, or you needed to do a servicing on your vehicle, you're not going to take it, and it's fairly new, brand new, you're not going to take it to just any jack and trade down the road. You're rather going to take it to the original manufacturer, because they have the manual and the blueprint of how that vehicle is meant to operate, because that's how they know how that vehicle was designed and created, and what it was designed and created to do. So when it starts to malfunction, they have the blueprint of how to fix it. The danger is, if you take that vehicle down the road to Jack the trader, he could bring other parts in to just make it fit, but not quite. And it could actually cause more damage to that vehicle than the good that was intended for it. It's the same as going to a therapist that's grounded in the Word, or going to a therapist that just improvises and brings in secular mindsets and ideologies, tools and techniques to fix something that they're not licensed to do. Yes, professions or the professional world, the secular world, has given them the license and certifications to treat patients, but because of the sensitivity of this area of practice, because of the sensitivity of this space and sphere of profession, the only person that has the jurisdiction and the authority to actually fully restore an entity back to its original state is the Creator. I do digress, but I was going to hammer on that point because it's so key that whoever is giving you counsel, whoever is giving you therapeutic, services, whoever you're paying to give you therapeutic services, counseling services, that person and individual, especially if you're a believer, needs to be grounded in the Word of God. And this is one of the reasons why I've come into this line of work, because when I was looking for someone that had this knowledge, there were very few and far between counselors that I could feel that I could trust. A lot of counselors that I was going to would often give you some ideas or some practices to go home and do and practice, and it just did not line up with my faith. There was a lot of clash there. Now I can talk to the secular world, I can talk to people and be like, yeah, you're having issues, yeah, let's do this exercise, let's do those techniques, let's do those exercises, but there's only so much limit by which an individual can go in counseling without sometimes going deeper into the actual origins of how that individual got into that place in the first place. But I hope I've been able to describe convincingly to you what the difference is between trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. I hope I've been able to convince you also of the signs and the symptoms to look out for. And I hope I've been able to give you some examples and tools of ways to overcome those traumatic flashbacks if you ever found yourself in those aspects, in that situation. In the next part, I want to talk about how trauma affects the mind and when the mind becomes a prison. In the meantime, don't forget to like, share this video and subscribe. If you found that this has been useful and helpful to you, do leave a comment down below, and do share with people, because there are people that are going through so much in this day and age. There is a need There is a need to get the conversation going. There's a need to bring to light the importance of healing, because if a generation does not heal, there's every likelihood and tendency that the same dysfunction that the previous generation went through will be passed on to the next generation. And it will be such a sore point and a sore case if we find out that people are going through trauma in childhood, they're growing up to become adults, and then they're passing on the same trauma to their children. Ideally, the next generation should be better than the previous generation. There's so much decay in society today because of the lack of moral standards, the decay in moral standards that's leaving people and human beings broken. And it would take people like yourself and me to actually stand up for the truth and teach people the truth, or help people heal from any level of brokenness that they found themselves in. This is where my heart is to showcase God's heart for healthy relationships, because even though a lot of marriages are in trouble, a lot of people are going through, not all marriages, there's some marriages that are doing it so well and we should learn from those examples, but there's some other marriages that they're just not getting it right. And it really stems from not just where you are as an adult, but a lot of brokenness actually stems from childhood. If we're able to arrest that level of brokenness in childhood, and we're able to speak to young adults, we're able to speak to the adolescents, we're able to help people even in their adult life recognize the impact of trauma on their lives and make them aware of how certain things and decisions can impact their life negatively. My dream is to see a utopian society that is devoid of pain. And I know the reality is that wouldn't happen until the new heaven and earth comes. But before the new heaven and earth comes, we have been commissioned to go into the world and preach the gospel and to set the captives free. And I am tired of seeing a lot of people walking so broken. And we need to do better as a society. So I hope this has helped you. I'll catch you in the next video where we talk about how trauma impacts the mind. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye. Lord, I just pray that you have your way, Lord. Let's jump right into it. It's been so long. It feels so weird talking to the camera, but I just have to do it. Okay.